There exists a narrative that the majority of history textbooks choose to recount in hushed tones, if they even mention it whatsoever. It is a chronicle concerning the most dominant empire on the planet, conducting two distinct military campaigns against a sovereign state, not due to a political assassination, nor because of a territorial disagreement, nor because of conflicting ideologies, but rather because that state possessed the courage to refuse the purchase of narcotics. And these were not just any ordinary narcotics. We are discussing opium, a substance characterized by such extreme addiction and destructiveness that it had already devastated millions of lives from within. The British Empire did not simply wander into this circumstance by chance. It meticulously engineered the entire apparatus of addiction, stretching from the poppy plantations of Bengal to the bustling harbors of Canton. When China attempted to bar the entrance to a commerce that was lethally infecting its citizens, Britain forcibly demolished that door using warships, heavy artillery, and treaties dictated at the point of a gun. The prize they seized from the ruins of that struggle, a minor, rugged island situated off the southern coast of China, would remain under British control for more than 150 years until the year 1997. That specific island was Hong Kong. This represents one of those historical chapters where every single layer you uncover reveals something even more repulsive beneath. What makes the account so deeply unsettling is that it was not carried out by rogue elements or clandestine operatives. It was officially authorized by Parliament, endorsed by the Crown, bankrolled by the East India Company, and applauded by a merchant class that had persuaded itself that the concept of free trade was a moral necessity, even when the specific commodity being exchanged was human suffering. Therefore, let us return to the point where the narrative truly commences, not within the borders of China, nor in the city of London, but amidst the humid poppy fields of colonial India. To comprehend why Britain initiated a war over the trade of opium, you must first recognize a dilemma that had been irritating the British Empire for several decades. This was a trade imbalance so extreme that it was depleting silver from England at a terrifying velocity. You see, the British general public had cultivated an insatiable craving for Chinese commodities. Tea, silk, and porcelain were the luxuries that the British middle and upper social classes felt they could not survive without. Tea, in particular, had become so deeply woven into British society that it was essentially a national institution. By the conclusion of the 1700s, Britain was importing tens of millions of pounds worth of Chinese tea on an annual basis. However, herein lay the complication. China did not desire anything that Britain had to offer for sale. The Qing Dynasty, which had governed China since 1644, functioned under a doctrine of total self-sufficiency. The Chinese emperor famously informed a British trade mission that China owned all things in great abundance and that there was absolutely no requirement for the manufactured goods of external barbarians. And he was not entirely incorrect. The economy of China was massive, its manufacturing skills were highly advanced, and its internal market was largely self-contained. British wool, British timepieces, and British manufactured items failed to make any impact. This generated what economists describe as a chronic trade deficit. Britain was losing silver rapidly to pay for all those various Chinese exports. The only thing moving in the opposite direction was precious metal exiting British vaults. For any empire founded upon commerce, this type of imbalance is not merely an inconvenience, it is an existential threat. Consequently, the men who directed the British East India Company, which by this stage was less of a commercial firm and more of a private empire possessing its own military and government, started searching for a product that would flip the flow of silver. They required something that China would not just want, but something China would desperately crave, something that would generate its own demand once it was introduced. They discovered it in the poppy fields of Bengal. The British East India Company had established a formal monopoly regarding opium cultivation within the Bengal region of India in 1773. This was not some random byproduct of commerce. It was a conscious and calculated strategy. The company constructed a sophisticated agricultural framework in which Indian peasants, many of whom were already destitute under colonial administration, were forced to cultivate poppies on their highest quality farmland. The opium was then processed at massive industrial facilities in locations like Patna and Benares, where laborers molded the raw paste into large spheres, packed them into crates constructed from Nepalese wood, and transported them down the Ganges River toward Kolkata. From that point, the crates were sold at auction to private British traders, who then loaded them onto swift-sailing vessels destined for the southern coast of China. The entire framework was architected with a deliberate layer of deniability. The East India Company itself did not technically sell the opium inside China. Instead, it sold the substance to intermediaries at auction, and those specific middlemen were the ones who operated the smuggling rings. This meant the company could maintain a claim of clean hands while still collecting massive profits from every single chest that departed from the Kolkata. It was a masterpiece of corporate plausible deniability, a framework that would incite envy in any modern criminal cartel. The statistics involved were truly staggering. In 1729, when the Qing Dynasty first prohibited the sale of opium for smoking purposes, imports totaled roughly 200 chests per year. By 1820, that figure had surged to approximately 10,000 chests annually. By 1838, the year prior to the outbreak of the First War, an estimated 40,000 chests of opium were flooding into China every single year. Each chest held roughly 140 pounds of processed opium. If you perform the calculation, that is over 5 million pounds of opium saturating a single nation annually. Virtually all of it was cultivated under the direct oversight of the British East India Company. The impact on Chinese society was nothing short of catastrophic. Opium addiction spread like a wildfire across every single social stratum. Laborers, soldiers, government bureaucrats, and even members of the imperial household fell victim to the drug. Entire local communities were hollowed out. Productivity plummeted in the regions affected. Families were shattered as primary earners spent every last bit of currency pursuing the next pipe. The economic destruction was just as intense as the human cost. Before the opium trade became dominant, China had benefited from a trade surplus with Europe. Silver flowed into the nation in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. But now the direction of flow had completely reversed. Chinese silver was pouring out of the country to pay for opium, triggering a monetary crisis that jeopardized the stability of the entire Qing economy. Taxes remained uncollected. Government salaries went unpaid. The currency itself was becoming unstable. The Qing court was not oblivious to what was occurring. There had been imperial decrees banning opium as far back as 1729, and these prohibitions were reissued multiple times throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s. However, enforcement was a different challenge entirely. Corruption was widespread. Local officials along the coastline were bribed by smugglers to ignore the activity. The profits were simply too massive for everyone involved on both the British and Chinese sides for the bans to have any real impact. But by the late 1830s, the crisis had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. The Daguang Emperor, observing his empire being slowly devoured from within, concluded that half measures were no longer a viable option. He required someone who was incorruptible, someone courageous, and someone prepared to confront not just the smugglers, but the most dominant trading empire on the planet. Thus, in December of 1838, he appointed a man named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner, granting him extraordinary authority and a singular mission: terminate the opium trade, regardless of what it takes. Lin Zexu was a truly remarkable individual, a scholar official possessing an impeccable reputation. He had ascended through the ranks of the Qing bureaucracy based on the strength of his intellect, his personal integrity, and his sincere concern for the well-being of common Chinese citizens. He was famous for his honesty within a system saturated with corruption, and he approached his new task with a degree of moral clarity that was rare for anyone in a position of authority. When he arrived in Canton, which served as the only port where international trade with China was legally allowed, he did not waste any time with polite discussions. He acted with surprising speed and determination. First, he commanded the arrest of Chinese opium distributors and the seizure of opium pipes throughout the province. He publicly executed several dealers to prove that the government was serious. Then, he shifted his focus toward the foreign merchants. He insisted that every British and American merchant in Canton surrender their entire stock of opium and sign a formal pledge never to import the narcotic again under the penalty of death. When the merchants showed hesitation, Lin ordered the factories where they resided and conducted business to be encircled and blockaded. Food deliveries were halted. Chinese staff were removed. The merchants were essentially held as hostages until they agreed to comply. The British superintendent of trade in China, a man named Charles Elliot, found himself in a hopeless situation. He could not fight his way out, and the merchants were becoming increasingly desperate. Consequently, Elliot made a monumental decision. He instructed the merchants to hand over their opium, promising them that the British government would reimburse them for their financial losses. In total, more than 20,000 chests of opium were surrendered to Commissioner Lin. The haul was worth millions, even by the financial standards of that period. Then occurred one of the most dramatic events in the entire history. Over the course of 23 days in June of 1839, Lin Zexu personally oversaw the destruction of the surrendered opium at Human, near the mouth of the Pearl River. Workers excavated massive trenches and filled them with a mixture of salt water and lime. The opium was dissolved and then flushed out into the sea. According to historical records, Lin even offered a prayer of apology to the spirit of the South China Sea, requesting the creatures of the water to move away temporarily so they would not be poisoned. It was a public display intended to show the resolve of the Chinese Empire, and it sent shock waves throughout the world. But Lin Zexu did not stop there. He also composed a remarkable letter addressed to Queen Victoria herself, a document that remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of diplomatic writing in history. In it, he appealed to her sense of morality. He highlighted that opium was illegal within Britain itself and questioned how she could justify saturating China with a substance that her own laws forbade her subjects from using. He asked whether the quest for profit could truly justify the poisoning of millions of people. He reminded her that China had always conducted trade in good faith, providing tea, silk, and porcelain in exchange for silver, products that nourished rather than destroyed. There remains some historical debate regarding whether Queen Victoria ever actually read the letter. What is not debated is that the British government chose not to respond to it. Instead, the British opted for war. The destruction of the opium provided London with exactly the excuse it required. In the halls of Parliament, the matter was carefully reframed. This was not about narcotics, the politicians claimed. This was about property rights. This was about free trade. This was about the dignity of the British flag. The fact that the property in question was a drug that was illegal in both China and Britain was conveniently left out of most of the discussion. A military expedition was sanctioned, and in June of 1840, a fleet of British warships and troop transports arrived off the Chinese coast. What followed was not so much a war as it was a display of overwhelming technological dominance. The Qing military was massive in terms of personnel, but it was fighting with weaponry and tactics that had not fundamentally changed in centuries. Chinese war junks, with their wooden hulls and outdated cannons, were no match for British steamships featuring iron hulls and modern artillery. The HMS Nemesis, a British steam-powered iron warship, became a symbol of the technological chasm between the two forces. It could navigate shallow coastal waters where sailing ships could not venture, and its guns could destroy Chinese defenses from distances that Chinese cannons could not reach. The British did not advance in a direct line toward Beijing. Instead, they carried out a series of devastating coastal attacks, capturing ports and islands as they moved northward along the Chinese coastline. They seized Chusan Island, blockaded the mouth of the Pearl River, and then pushed further north, threatening the essential grain transport route that linked southern China to the capital city. The message was unmistakable. Britain could cut off China's internal supply lines at will. The combat was frequently brutal and lopsided. At the Battle of Canton in May of 1841, British forces crushed Chinese defenses. At Amoy, at Ningbo, and at Chapu, the same pattern occurred. Chinese soldiers fought with immense bravery, sometimes literally to the final man, but they were simply outmatched by superior firepower. The technological gap was not a minor advantage. It was a vast abyss. By the summer of 1842, British forces had advanced all the way up the Yangtze River and were threatening the city of Nanjing. The Qing court, facing the possibility of losing control over the most vital waterway in the empire, finally consented to negotiate. On the 29th of August 1842, aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored on the Yangtze River at Nanjing, Chinese officials signed what would be known as the Treaty of Nanking. It was the first of what Chinese historians describe as the unequal treaties, and it signaled the start of what China still calls its century of humiliation. The conditions were devastating. China was compelled to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were open to British trade and residence, ending the old Canton system that had restricted all foreign commerce to a single spot. China was commanded to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, categorized as follows: 6 million for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed, 3 million for debts Chinese merchants owed to British traders, and 12 million to cover the expenses of the war itself. Consider that for a moment. China was being forced to pay for the war that Britain had waged against it. The treaty also established a fixed tariff system that robbed China of the power to set its own trade duties, and it granted British citizens in China extraterritorial rights, meaning they could only be tried in British courts, even for crimes committed on Chinese soil. What the Treaty of Nanking notably failed to do was mention opium by name. The legality of the trade was left intentionally vague. However, the practical result was clear. With China's capacity to enforce its own laws weakened, and with British merchants now operating freely in 5 major ports, opium imports did not decrease after the treaty. They doubled. By 1860, roughly 60,000 chests of opium were being imported into China annually. As for Commissioner Lin Zexu, the man who had tried to protect his nation from addiction, the Daoguang Emperor blamed him for causing the war. He was stripped of his titles and sent into exile in the distant northwest frontier of Xinjiang. It would take later generations to recognize him as a national hero. Today, he is honored in China as a pioneer in the war on drugs, a man who stood up to imperial aggression at great personal cost. But the story does not conclude with the First War because Britain was not satisfied. The Treaty of Nanking had opened the door, but British merchants wanted it ripped off its hinges. Trade volumes grew after 1842, but the British government and its commercial interests saw even more potential for market growth. They wanted the opium trade fully legalized. They wanted access to the Chinese interior, not just the coastal ports. They wanted foreign diplomats permanently stationed in Beijing, something the Qing court saw as an unacceptable insult to Chinese sovereignty. And they wanted the treaty renegotiated on even more favorable terms. The excuse for the Second Opium War arrived in October of 1856, when Chinese officials in Canton boarded a ship named the Arrow. The vessel was Chinese-owned but was registered under a British flag and was suspected of smuggling and piracy. Chinese authorities detained several crew members. The British claimed this was an insult to the British flag, even though there was significant doubt about whether the ship's British registration was even valid at the time. Nevertheless, it was the excuse that was required. France joined the British cause, using the execution of a French missionary in the Chinese interior as its own pretext for intervention. Together, the Anglo-French coalition assembled a powerful military force and launched what would become a far more destructive conflict than the First War. The Second Opium War occurred in 2 major stages. In the first stage, between 1856 and 1858, British and French forces seized Canton and pushed north to the port city of Tianjin, threatening Beijing itself. The Qing court, already weakened by the massive Taiping rebellion raging across southern China, had no ability to fight both an internal civil war and an external invasion at the same time. In June of 1858, the Chinese were forced to sign the treaties of Tianjin with Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. The terms were even more severe than those of the Treaty of Nanking. 11 additional ports were opened to foreign trade. Foreign diplomats were granted the right to establish permanent residences in Beijing. Christian missionaries were given the right to travel and proselytize throughout the Chinese interior. And critically, the import of opium into China was formally legalized. The drug that had devastated Chinese society for decades, the substance that had provided the original cause of the wars, was now legal by treaty. China had been forced to accept the very thing it had fought 2 wars to prevent. But the Qing court attempted one final act of defiance. They refused to ratify the treaties and blocked a diplomatic delegation that was trying to travel to Beijing to finalize the agreement. Chinese forces fired on British ships near the Taku forts, and several British negotiators were captured, tortured, and killed. This act of resistance, the capture and killing of the diplomatic envoys, sealed China's fate in the most devastating way imaginable. In 1860, a combined Anglo-French force of nearly 18,000 troops landed near Beijing and fought their way to the capital. The Battle of Palikao in September of 1860 saw Qing forces, including Mongol cavalry, shattered by modern European rifles and artillery. The road to Beijing was now completely open. The Xianfeng emperor fled the capital, a humiliation that no Chinese ruler had suffered in centuries. Then came the act of destruction that still resonates in Chinese memory to this day. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, ordered his troops to loot and burn the Yuanmingyuan, the old summer palace. This was not some minor government building. The Yuanmingyuan was one of the most magnificent architectural complexes in the world. It was a vast expanse of palaces, gardens, temples, and pavilions that had been built and refined over more than a century. It contained priceless artworks, ancient manuscripts, porcelain, jade, silks, and cultural artifacts that represented the accumulated heritage of Chinese civilization. British and French soldiers spent days looting the complex before putting it to the torch. The fires burned for 3 days and the smoke was visible from Beijing itself. The Yongle Encyclopedia, which had been the largest encyclopedia in the world at the time of its creation during the Ming Dynasty, was among the treasures destroyed. Only a tiny fraction of its volumes survived. The burning of the Summer Palace was more than an act of military retribution. It was a calculated act of cultural humiliation designed to show the Chinese court that no corner of the empire was beyond the reach of Western power. Lord Elgin himself reportedly justified the destruction by saying that it would make a lasting impression on the emperor and demonstrate that his palaces were not immune to Western force. With Beijing effectively occupied and the emperor in exile, his brother, Prince Gong, was left to negotiate surrender. In October of 1860, the Convention of Peking was signed, confirming all the terms of the treaties of Tianjin and adding new concessions. The Kowloon Peninsula, directly across the harbor from Hong Kong Island, was ceded to Britain. The indemnity payments were increased. Foreign powers gained the right to maintain permanent military garrisons in Beijing, and the opium trade, already legalized by treaty, surged to unprecedented levels. Britain now held Hong Kong Island and Kowloon. But the final piece of the puzzle would come in 1898. By the late 19th century, the European powers were engaged in what historians call the scramble for concessions, carving out spheres of influence across a weakened China. When France leased the territory of Guangzhou on the southern coast, Britain seized the opportunity to demand an extension of its Hong Kong territory. On the 9th of June, 1898, the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory was signed, leasing to Britain a vast swath of land and 235 outlying islands known as the New Territories. The lease was set at 99 years, effective from the 1st of July, 1898, and expiring on the 30th of June, 1997. At the time, 99 years must have seemed like forever, but eventually the clock ran out. What makes this entire saga so deeply uncomfortable is not just the violence or the hypocrisy. It is the fact that it was all done under the banner of progress. The British justified their actions through the language of free trade, a principle they held sacred when it served their interests and conveniently ignored when it did not. The great irony is that opium was illegal in Britain itself. British law prohibited the recreational use of opium domestically, and yet the British government was willing to wage 2 wars to force another nation to accept that same substance. The contradiction was not lost on everyone. Within Britain itself, there was significant opposition to the Opium Wars. Members of Parliament denounced the conflict as immoral. The young William Gladstone, who would later become Prime Minister, declared that he did not know and had never read of a war more unjust in its origins. Public opinion in both Britain and America was divided, with many voices condemning the trade as an abomination. But the profits were simply too large, and the strategic interests too compelling for morality to carry the day. The profits were, by any measure, extraordinary. Opium revenue funded a significant portion of the British East India Company's operations in India, and the taxes paid on those profits comprised an ever-growing percentage of British government revenue. The entire colonial apparatus of British India was, to a significant degree, financed by the opium trade. The poppy fields of Bengal and Bihar were not just agricultural enterprises, they were the financial engines of empire. The human cost of that engine was borne entirely by the people who had no voice in the arrangement: the Indian peasants who were forced to grow poppies instead of food, and the Chinese addicts whose lives were consumed by the drug. The consequences of the Opium Wars rippled far beyond the immediate military defeats. They set in motion a chain of events that would reshape China in the entire region for the next century and a half. The unequal treaties shattered the Qing dynasty's legitimacy. A ruling dynasty derives its authority from its ability to protect its people, and the Qing had demonstrably failed. The humiliation of the Opium Wars, combined with the ongoing devastation of the Taiping Rebellion, which claimed an estimated 20 million to 30 million lives, plunged China into decades of internal chaos. The dynasty limped on until 1912, when it was finally overthrown and replaced by the Republic of China, but its authority had been fatally undermined by the defeats of 1842 and 1860. The treaty port system that emerged from these wars created enclaves of foreign privilege across China's coast. Shanghai, in particular, transformed from a modest trading town into a major international city, but one where Chinese citizens were second class in their own country. The famous sign in a Shanghai park that allegedly read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed," may be apocryphal in its exact wording, but the sentiment it captures was entirely real. Foreigners in China lived under their own laws, enforced by their own courts, and Chinese authorities had no jurisdiction over them. This system of extraterritoriality was not dismantled until 1943. Meanwhile, the territory that Britain had extracted from China, Hong Kong, underwent an extraordinary transformation. What had been a sparsely populated island became one of the most dynamic commercial centers in Asia. The deep natural harbor that had attracted the British in the first place made Hong Kong an ideal trading hub. The combination of British legal institutions, Chinese entrepreneurial energy, and its strategic location on the shipping lanes between Europe and East Asia turned it into a global financial powerhouse. By the 20th century, Hong Kong was a thriving city of skyscrapers and container ports, a place where East met West in a concentrated burst of commerce and culture. And yet, the foundation upon which all of that prosperity was built remained what it had always been: a war fought to protect the right to sell drugs. As the 20th century progressed, the question of Hong Kong's future loomed ever larger. The new territory's lease, with its 99-year term, had a very specific expiration date. As that date approached, the political landscape had changed beyond recognition. The China that had been forced to sign the unequal treaties was long gone. In its place stood the People's Republic of China, a nuclear-armed state with one of the largest economies in the world and a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. The Communist Party of China had never recognized the treaties as legitimate. From Beijing's perspective, every square inch of Hong Kong was sovereign Chinese territory that had been occupied by a foreign power. In the early 1980s, with the lease expiration now less than 2 decades away, businesses in Hong Kong began pressuring the British government for clarity. Property leases, mortgages, long-term contracts, all of these instruments required some assurance about what would happen after 1997. It was actually the British administration, not Beijing, that initiated the discussions about the handover. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher traveled to Beijing in 1982 to begin negotiations with the Chinese leadership, including Deng Xiaoping. Thatcher initially explored the possibility of retaining sovereignty over Hong Kong Island and southern Kowloon, which had been ceded in perpetuity by the treaties of 1842 and 1860, even if the new territories had to be returned. But this position quickly proved untenable. The new territories comprised the vast majority of Hong Kong's land area. The airport was there. The water supply infrastructure was there. Hong Kong Island and Kowloon simply could not function as independent entities without the new territories. Deng Xiaoping made it clear that China would resume sovereignty over all of Hong Kong, and that there was no room for negotiation on that fundamental point. The only question was how the transition would be managed. The negotiations were tense, and at times they nearly collapsed. Economic confidence in Hong Kong plunged during the negotiation period, and there was a real fear among Hong Kong residents about what life under communist rule would mean for a city that had thrived under the rule of law, free markets, and civil liberties. But eventually, on the 19th of December 1984, Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Under its terms, Britain would return Hong Kong to China on the 1st of July 1997. In return, China agreed to govern Hong Kong as a special administrative region under the principle of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would retain its capitalist economy, its legal system, its civil liberties, and its way of life for a period of 50 years after the handover, meaning until 2047. The handover ceremony itself, held at midnight on the 30th of June 1997, was a meticulously choreographed event watched by millions around the world. Prince Charles represented the British Crown, President Jiang Zemin represented the People's Republic, the Union Jack was lowered, the Chinese flag was raised, and 156 years of British colonial rule came to a quiet, formal end. For many, it was the symbolic close of the British Empire itself. The last significant colony had been returned to its original owner. But the story did not end with the ceremony. The promises made in the Joint Declaration and enshrined in Hong Kong's basic law became the subject of increasing tension in the decades that followed. The 50-year guarantee of autonomy, which had seemed so reassuring in 1984, began to feel less certain as Beijing's political influence over Hong Kong steadily grew. The introduction of national security legislation in 2020 reshaped the political landscape of the city in profound ways. The question of whether the one country, two systems framework would survive until 2047 remains one of the defining geopolitical tensions of our era. There is one more dimension to the story that deserves attention, because it connects the Opium Wars to something much larger than just the relationship between Britain and China. The forced opening of China through military violence established a template that other imperial powers quickly followed. France, Russia, Germany, Japan, and the United States all extracted their own concessions, treaty ports, and special privileges from a weakened Qing dynasty. The Treaty of Nanking was not just a bilateral agreement. It was the first crack in a dam that released a flood of foreign exploitation. The most favored nation clauses that Britain inserted into its treaties meant that any privilege China granted to one foreign power automatically extended to all the others. Each new concession cascaded into further losses of sovereignty. This pattern of exploitation would directly contribute to the forces that shaped 20th century China. From the collapse of the Qing dynasty to the warlord era, to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, to the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong explicitly invoked a century of humiliation as a motivating force in his revolution. The memory of the Opium Wars became foundational to modern Chinese national identity, a reminder of what happens when a nation is too weak to defend itself against foreign aggression. It is not an exaggeration to say that the wars Britain fought to sell opium in the 1840s and 1860s helped set in motion the political forces that would produce the People's Republic of China itself. The economic innovations that the opium trade generated had their own legacy. The financial instruments developed to manage the risks of smuggling opium into China, the bills of exchange, the insurance contracts, the complex networks of credit that connected Kolkata to Canton to London. These were the building blocks of modern international finance. The opium trade was, in a very real sense, one of the earliest examples of a truly global supply chain, one that connected Indian agriculture, British manufacturing, Chinese consumption, and international banking into a single integrated system. The profits from that system funded railways in Britain, built mansions in Kolkata, and underwrote the expansion of the British Empire across multiple continents. Even the Rothschild family, those legendary architects of European finance, had connections to the web of commerce that the opium trade sustained. The East India Company's operations were deeply embedded in the financial networks that linked London, Bombay, and Canton. The fortunes that were made in the opium trade did not simply disappear when the wars ended. They were reinvested, diversified, and multiplied over generations, contributing to the wealth structures that still shape global finance today. So when we look at the Opium Wars, we are not just looking at a historical curiosity. We are looking at a foundational event in the creation of the modern world, one that shaped the rise and fall of empires, the architecture of international trade, the boundaries of nation-states, and the moral contradictions at the heart of Western capitalism. It is a story about what happens when the logic of profit is allowed to override every other consideration, when a nation's sovereignty is treated as an obstacle to commerce rather than a right, and when the language of freedom is used to justify the most unfree of outcomes. The opium that the British East India Company grew in Bengal, processed in Patna, auctioned in Kolkata, and smuggled into Canton may be long gone. The trenches where Lin Zexu dissolved 20,000 chests of poison in lime and salt water have been covered over by the modern city of Dongguan. The warships that bombarded the Taku forts and sailed up the Yangtze have rusted into oblivion, but the consequences of what happened in those decades are still very much alive. They are alive in the skyscrapers of Hong Kong. They are alive in the political tensions of the South China Sea. They are alive in China's deep institutional memory of foreign humiliation, a memory that shapes its foreign policy, its military posture, and its relationship with the West to this day. Perhaps the most important lesson of all is this. When Britain destroyed the Summer Palace and forced China to legalize the opium trade, it did not just win a war. It created a wound that has never fully healed. Wounds like that, the kind inflicted not just on a government, but on the dignity of an entire civilization, have a way of echoing through centuries. They shape the way nations see themselves and, more importantly, the way they see the rest of the world. The story of the Opium Wars is a story about power, about greed, about the machinery of empire, and about the terrible things that can happen when a nation decides that its economic interests are more important than the lives and sovereignty of another people. It is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. If this historical journey has changed the way you perceive the origins of modern global trade and the scars of empire, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. We are dedicated to unearthing the history that they have tried to bury beneath layers of silence. Let us plant the seeds of a more informed future together. The next hidden treasury of our past will be opened very soon. Stay tuned.